All right, we'll go ahead and get it going. Good morning, all, and also good morning to the online audience. It's a hybrid class, so we are doing people live and people via Zoom. We appreciate the attendance on both parts. So today's talk is moles, voles, and gophers. We'll touch briefly on a few of the other tunnelers you might see or diggers you might see, but we're really going to focus on these three primary pest issues as well as terrestrial mammals. And so I will take questions live as we go. It's a relatively short class. Also, anybody who is online, if you want to type any questions into the chat, I've got the bar up and I'll answer those questions as we go as well. If you'd like to save your questions till the end, that's fine too. We'll take them there. So when we look at mole, vole, and gopher control, it is very, very, very important that we identify what our problem really is, because unfortunately they are, or fortunately in some cases, they're very different critters with very different habitat behaviors,
the old one,
lifestyles.
Here.
Very different control measures will be effective. So unfortunately, that's a challenge. So broadly speaking, we can talk about holes, because you're more likely to see the holes or the evidence than you are any of the individual critters most of the time. So first one we want to talk about here is our western pocket gopher. This is our more common pest out here in the valley, all in all. And they tend to produce very large networks of holes. The holes go deep. They throw a dirt mound, and when you see them tunneling, you will note that they come up and they actually turn around and they kick the dirt out of the hole. So you will see a hole that is visible. It may be plugged, as you can see in the picture, but it also may be wide open if they're actively working it. And a relatively fan-shaped mound of dirt. So the hole will be visible and will typically be either away from the pile slightly or right on the edge of the dirt pile. So that's your pocket gopher. Note the teeth. In the nice close-up photo, he was posing for the camera nicely for the gentleman who took that picture. The incisors, that you can see that they are substantially herbivorous critters that eat lots and lots of plant material, all sorts of density, or they wouldn't have teeth like that. So roots, tubers, some woody stuff, and a lot of green stuff is what they'll go through. So pocket gophers live as a colony. It's typically a family grouping to one extent or another, and they reproduce fairly effectively and very rapidly. So you will typically develop a network of tunnels that are both access in and out of the network, in and out of the warren accesses, but also deep living quarters where they actually spend a lot of time raising young down underground. Depending on what your soil availability is, it can be quite deep. They go quite a ways down. This is a mole. So moles are primarily insectivorous. They eat bugs and worms. That being said, anywhere from 20 to 40% of their diet can be small plant material and roots as well. So they do some damage, but they're not really seeking plants to eat as such. They are primarily eating other things. Mound identification is always somewhat challenging, but typically a mole mound, even though it can be quite large, the moles do get quite big and their tunnels can be quite substantial, are typically relatively volcanic shaped or conic, with the hole completely obscured under the center of the mound. Okay. Now, moles also tend to develop fairly wide-ranging tunnel systems, but typically not super deep. And they are covering a large area because they are foraging. So they dig a lot of just subsurface foraging tunnels, and you can sometimes see them actually heaving the soil along as they're going. And they're hunting for things to eat. What that means in terms of your control measures is understand that just because they have been there doesn't mean they're going to be spending a lot of time right there. So you have to find the deeper warren tunnels to actually get some degree of control of it. Moles are extremely territorial. So typically you will have in any given territory a single mated pair while they are raising that young, and then they kick the young out. Okay. The problem with that approach to mole control is that what you define as a territory and what they define as a territory is not necessarily the same thing. A backyard might have 2 or 3 zones with 2 or 3 mated pairs, potentially, if the food resources are really, really good. So be aware of that when we say there's only likely to be 1 or 2. Well, yes, but there could be more overlapping in the territories. They do defend these territories. They tend to chase out interlopers. So it tends to be pretty defined. Meadow vole is a type of mouse. It's a big mouse, and if you look at a close-up of its face and teeth, it looks almost more like a miniature gopher in many regards than it does a mouse. They are somewhat aggressive in the sense of that, they won't chase you or anything, but like if you see a cat catch one and play with it, where other mice will try to scurry and hide, voles will actually rear up and try to resist. So they're big enough to do that. So one of the bigger mice. Meadow voles live in colonies of a large number of individuals wherever the habitat is good. They develop small, round holes with usually no or minimal visible dirt trail. And they develop a lot of them. They'll develop a whole network of little holes like that are not necessarily connected, that are independent. And they'll only be using a small percentage of those holes at any given point in time. Reproductive rate is extraordinarily fast in the sense of something like 7 or 8 generations per year. So, and like rats and other rats and mice, they by the time your second generation or third generation is out, that first generation is back to reproductive age. So populations grow really, really, really fast. Voles are substantial pests. They eat the root systems of plants, and they eat seeds and shoots. They will come up and girdle bark of woody plants like small young trees and shrubs. They're a real problem in orchards. So as a serious pest, and because of the reproductive rate, very, very hard to get control of. So let's sit back a minute. So those are the primary 3 pests we're going to be talking about. Now, you're going to see all kinds of other holes occur in your garden and yard from time to time. My favorite is raccoons. Okay, so raccoons are omnivorous. They eat just about anything to one extent or another. They really, really like bugs and grubs when they can catch them. And so when there is a substantial grub population or cricket population in your yard, they will go along, and they're very, very acute sense of hearing, and they will chase down these critters. And then they will grab a section of turf and tear it out of the ground, fold it over, and eat the bug. And then they are not nice golfers. They don't fill in their divots. They leave this patch of turf laying on the side with this really shallow hole where they found the critter underneath. Call it mad golfer disease. And that's a raccoon. They're not significant pests except in some vegetable and fruit crops as actual fruit and eating pest. But they can cause some unsightly blemishes in your landscape as well. Rats are tunnelers as well. We will typically see rat tunnels, and they're typically fairly large holes, but following the vole pattern, there may or may not be much of a dirt mound around it. They will typically be affiliated with some sort of structure for protection. They'll be tunneling under a tree root or tunneling under the foundation of a building or that kind of a situation, tunneling into a brush pile. Skunks and more rarely foxes and coyotes also dig holes for denning, for nesting. Skunks will also dig down into rodent holes. They are active predators, and they will sometimes, if they think they can get down to it, they will try to chase after by digging into the hole. Those are your most likely causes. We also have ground squirrels, which very large holes with a ring-shaped volcanic mound. Dirt is often very, very substantial because they excavate very deep. Most of your ground squirrels are not serious home garden pests. They're serious agricultural pests, however, both in terms of risk to livestock. The holes are big enough that animals step in and break their legs, but also in terms of orcharding crops in particular. And then tree squirrels and other smaller squirrels that are not major ground squirrels will dig to hide nuts and things like that. But we'll focus on the three primaries today, and understanding the difference between their life habits and how you're going to control them is kind of the crux of the rest of the talk here. So moles, let's start with moles because it's the most rosy outcome realistically, okay? Can you live with moles? Yeah, sure. They're not usually doing that much plant damage. They have substantial aesthetic issues, especially in flower beds in turf areas. They can, in the course of their tunneling, sometimes channel away water. So in other words, they get in and they're working the bugs around the root system of a newly planted plant in particular. And when they leave their tunnels, when you're trying to water, the tunnels just channel all the water away and parts of the root zone dry out because they get lots of air exposure in there. That can be a significant impact in the landscape. So moles have a low reproductive rate and a low population density. The single best way to control moles is to trap them because you can trap enough to make a difference. There are a number of traps. We'll hit some traps a little bit later. You can also use toxin baits, various poisonous baits for mole control. But no matter what they say on the label, all these pellet baits that say mole and gopher baits are pretty ineffective for mole control. It's not what they're trying to eat. If you get enough of those granules down in the tunnel while the mole is working that immediate section, you might accidentally kill them. But they don't eat those baits, and so they don't absorb the toxins. You need baits that mimic a worm or mimic a grub for control. There are also a number of repellent, both device repellents and granular repellents. These can be ineffective to moderately effective on a lot of critters. They can be reasonably effective on moles. Again, low population density. Some of the best repellents for moles specifically are the castor-based ones. So castor oil-based granules. You spread them out and you use them to chase the moles out of a specific area. They're not, as such, poisonous, at least not in the volumes you're putting down. So the trick to doing this effectively is figure out where your moles are actively working and where you don't want them to go. And you start several feet back into the area you don't want them to go, and you do a band of this granule that incorporates the area you're trying to keep them out of and over the area they're starting to work. And then they will move. And then you can come behind them and put another band, and you can just slowly, incrementally chase them out of a given area. Bear in mind that this is a relatively short-term solution. It will give you some direct control of the individual moles that are present right there. But unfortunately, it wears off. They will come back when those moles reproduce and they chase the kids out. The kids are likely, if that's still a good territory, likely to come in. Other repellent level controls of moles that we hear about, but we don't necessarily endorse. Controlling your insect population in your soil. They are insect eaters. The problem is anything that will substantially control your insects in your soil is going to control a lot more than you want to control. A lot of worms, a lot of beneficials. So sure, you won't have moles, but also your soil will become less valuable, and we're kind of ruining the biosphere of your soil. So we don't advocate doing that. It is an approach that is sometimes used. Trapping is still probably the single best control for moles. Gophers. Gophers do substantial amounts of damage to the tops of plants as well as some root zone. They're a substantial tuber pest. In the vegetable garden, they'll go after all kinds of leafy crops and all kinds of tuber crops. You'll see them going, you can go pulling garlic right down the hole. You'll go out and I can actually watch a carrot disappear. Yeah. So they're working from underground and they're pulling them down and eating. Because the population densities are relatively high and the reproductive rates are relatively high, you can try trapping, especially if you're early in an infestation. You may end up resorting to baits, to poisons to control gophers, because it's really hard to trap enough gophers to knock down your population. I say early on, easy enough. When you've got 30 or 40 of them, you're not going to win that game. Okay. Traps are designed to go down in the active tunnels, usually vertically. And baits can also be delivered in a way that reduces your non-target toxicity by delivering them clear way down in the hole, so you're not getting exposure to a lot of non-target animals. The repellents are of minimal effectiveness on gophers, even though many of them are rated for them. The sonic repellents are the best gopher repellent, but they don't last. They get used to the sound. The granular repellents have been relatively ineffective in my experience. Voles. Well, if I had a real solution for your vole problems, I would be a very rich man, because it's not only on the home garden level. These are serious multi-million-dollar agricultural pests. To see how bad it really can get, you just look at some of the examples. If you go back through the news articles in the farming industry, you can see some of the bad vole years in like Lane County, where they grow a lot of grass seed. Some of these farmers lost 40% of grass seed field crop, vole infestation, right? So that's the scale of damage that they're capable of. So this is why this is a huge issue. So baits are your control. Yes, you can trap them with mouse traps if baited appropriately and set appropriately, but you will never win that battle. There are too many of them and reproduce way too fast. And so we'll talk a little bit more now about some of the specific controls. So baits. Granular baits are designed for rodent control. They work really well on gophers and pretty well on voles if you can apply them where the voles are feeding. They are relatively hazardous products, okay? So they basically break down into phosgene, basically to poison gas as they get moist. So this is an issue. Now, the drawback is the acute toxicity. The advantage is that it doesn't tend to accumulate up the predatory stream as fast as some of the alternatives. That being said, yes, this is an issue. You do want to make sure that you are doing your best to control non-target exposures. This includes critters that are eating them. Right? I worry less about cats unless you're in a very defined area where you're baiting heavily, because the percentage of diet that a cat is going to take in rodents is not that high. We worry a lot more about owls, hawks. Some of our owl species out here, 90% of their diet is small rodents. Some of your kestrels are about that level too. So, right, your basic phosphorics are at least reasonably breaking down. They don't concentrate up the food chain as fast, but there's some risks, absolutely. So be judicious. Your poison mealworms on the you see on the other picture there are specifically designed for mole control. That one is that particular brand is an actual worm, jelly worm, that you stick down in the foraging tunnels where they're most active. You can also put it down in the brood tunnels if you can get a little deeper, if you can find a hole that goes down a little bit. They're still hazardous, but they're less likely to give you risks as long as you handle them respectfully. The problem with the peanuts and pellet baits, besides the non-target risk, of course, is that they produce a lot of dust in the canister. You do not want to be inhaling this. Wear dust filter masks and wear gloves when you're handling the stuff and wash up thoroughly afterwards. But avoid your exposure to it. It is hazardous. But unfortunately, with voles, it may be your best approach, your only effective approach. And for gophers, it's often the best approach. So you can control also your exposure to these products and provide adequate access for the pests to this with using baiting stations. There's a variety of strategies for this. So when you have a vole population, like in an orchard where they're coming up and hitting the grapevines or hitting the young fruit trees, create a little T station like this. So this is PVC with joints, slip joints. They're not even glued on, they're just stuck together. So you have two on the ground lateral joints. This can be anything much over an inch in PVC. There's plenty of space for voles to get into. The cap on the top, you tie it to a stake or you tie it to the tree trunk so it doesn't tip over. Now to bait, you can just lift the cap off drop your granules down, and they stay right there in the center of that station. The only thing that's getting into there is critters the size that can fit into that tube. So you're not getting birds, songbirds and such. You're not getting any larger mammals that are finding the bait attractive for any of a number of reasons. You're literally controlling specifically rodents with it. A smaller scale, I do the same thing at home with occasional rat pests or vole pests in my garden by creating a small station. I could literally take a nursery container because, gee, I have lots of nursery containers. Surprise, surprise. And I just take pruners. I cut a little horseshoe-shaped section out to provide access. I use that section of plastic I cut out to put the tray to put the bait on. Put the pot upside down over that. Put a weight on it so it doesn't get knocked over readily. And that again controls the access to the bait, so you're not picking up non-target animals through your baits. And these can be very effective where you have substantial enough populations or populations that are feeding localized enough that you can control them that way. Yes, question.
I've had experience, I think, with cats eating poison critters and then the cat does.
Okay, so the question for the people I know online can't hear was she's had experience with her pet's cats eating poisoned rodents and then dying. And that is a real thing, but it's probably not the types of baits we're talking about here. We're talking about baits like strychnine baits, perhaps, and things like that. Decon. Yeah, it's completely different, and it tends to stay in the. It takes less of it to affect a larger animal, and it tends to kind of stay in the body pretty readily, easily consumed up. Not that the baits we're recommending are super safe. Be respectful of them, but they are not the same type of baits. A lot of those other rodent baits have been outlawed in much of the world, Europe, for example, because of that very issue. And again, they're mostly not worried about the pets; they're worried about the raptors, the owl populations, especially. So, yes, it is an issue you want to be aware of. I'm less concerned about it with iron phosphate or with phosphate type baits than I am with strychnines and such. But that does not make these baits absolutely safe by any means.
So then the vole will go in, eat it, and then leave to die?
Yes.
Is that the?
Okay. Yeah, so the question was, the critters come in, eat the bait, and leave to die. Ideally, yes, and for the most part that happens. They're not that quick acting of baits. They are in ingestion and then break down baits. Doesn't always happen that way. Absolutely, you do have some die above ground. Yeah. Okay, gassers. These are devices to control, but to ignite, stick down the tunnel, and let the gas generated suffocate or poison out the critters involved. So again, you notice they're labeled for moles, gophers, and a variety, skunks, ground squirrels, whatever. So how effective are they really? Well, on relatively small networks of gophers, or if you apply them broadly throughout a larger colony of gophers, they can kill a fair amount of everybody who's home, especially who's hanging down low. On larger networks, single gassers are not going to generate enough to fill that tunnel system. Skunks nesting, which I normally wouldn't want to control so much personally. They're effective predators, even if they can be a bit obnoxious at times. Ground squirrels, very effective. Moles, yeah, not so much. The mole systems are shallow and run very extensively horizontally. And these work by being heavier than air and really drenching down to where they're living, to actual living quarters. So things that tend to have really deep living tunnels, these work pretty well on. Things that have a lot of relatively shallow tunnel systems, not so much. Traps. It is important, as we said at the outset, to figure out what you've got, because different traps are configured to catch different things. Mole traps come in quite a variety of configurations. That old Victor is a pain to set because the spring is so strong, but it is still one of the best mole traps on the market. So the one thing that mole traps will have in common is that you will either have a system like that has a trigger in the middle with two sets of active jaws, or you will have two traps that you set opposite directions because there is no way of predicting what direction that mole is moving through the tunnels. Typical application for these types of traps is to actually dig out a small section of tunnel, set the trap, and cover it over with a bucket so that there's no daylight. It is worth noting that the way those trigger mechanisms are designed sometimes avoids triggering because it's usually on the upper surface of the trap, so it doesn't obviously interfere with in course of setting or with the trap action itself. One of the ways you can make sure your moles trigger those traps is to take a rock or a walnut or even a chunk of clod or a chunk of cut potato and placing it on the floor of the tunnel right below where the trigger mechanism is for the trap. Then this mole is coming along and it's either going to go over the obstruction or it's going to try to kick that obstruction out of the way. And in the course of that, it's more likely to hunch up and actually hit the trigger mechanism, causing the trap to trigger. Yes, question?
So when you're handling that kind of a trap, you have to make sure you're wearing gloves so they don't smell you. Is that even a factor?
Right. So the question is, human scent, is that a factor on these traps? Yes, but not as much as you might think. They're fairly used to things being handled by people in their immediate spheres. It's more a problem, I would say, with moles than with just about anything else, though, because moles are more sensitive. They have a really limited sensory apparatus, and what sensory apparatus they have is very finely tuned. Wearing gloves is generally a good idea. Human scents on traps are not ideal. On the flip side of that, after a couple of days out in the weather, it's pretty not likely to have much impact. Not like traps for more, shall we say, more intelligent critters that are less hardwired. Do be careful setting mole traps in particular. Mole traps are designed to react really, really fast. They will take a finger off if you're not careful. So most of them have some sort of a guard mechanism that you put in place while you're setting the trap and positioning it, and then you flip the safety off after you're done handling it. And do use those. That's yeah, it's pretty exciting when they go off. Yeah, I mean the pinching traps are bad enough, the ones with the little sharp things that poke in, but that will hurt. But these scissor jaw traps are very, very strong. So be respectful. Repellents, sonic repellents. Sonic repellents work on all these critters to a limited degree for a limited period of time. So as a short-term solution to an immediate problem, they can be effective. The better ones will cover several thousand square feet per spike put in. Yeah, really, especially for moles in particular. Somewhat less effective on gophers, not bad on voles, but all these critters simply get used to them over time. I would personally, where I would use them, I would spring on extra money for the solar powered ones, the battery powered ones. You never remember to get out there and keep an eye on the battery status on. So solar powered ones will work fairly effectively, even in our limited sun exposure in the Pacific Northwest. Granular and liquid repellents for moles and voles are prime, and they've taken gopher off the label, a lot of them now, are primarily castor oil based, though they often have other things in them as well. They are effective on moles. They're pretty effective on voles. They're expensive to do a sizable area with, and they don't last for a long period of time. But again, it's a short-term solution, or for small populations like moles, might be worth an approach because the toxicity is substantially reduced. So that's what I had for you on mole, vole, and gopher control for recommendations. At this point, would certainly appreciate any questions you might have on the topic. I wish I had more firm, absolute answers for you, but it is a tough situation. Yes, what have you got? So can we use things around our plants to avoid attracting pests to a limited degree? You'll find that using things like hazelnut shells might deter some. On the other hand, might encourage others. For the most part, there's nothing that is deterrent in that value. Now, where vole populations are substantial or gopher populations are substantial, it's really common to put sort of a mesh in the ground. So you're actually planting inside a submerged pot, basically, that the pot is a wire mesh to keep the critters out. More important than what you put around your plants is what you don't let be around your plants. So especially for voles and to some extent for gophers, which spend a lot of time above ground foraging, if you keep your weeds and grasses controlled around your desirable plants, anything that exposes them to predation is valuable for deterring them. Similarly, on a somewhat larger scale than most people are practicing in their backyard, putting raptor perches. Have you seen the blueberry places around here where they have all these nice big tall T-bars out in their orchards? Those are, so naturally got a natural log basically on top of a very tall post. Those are to encourage hawks to sit and land, and owls as well, to sit and land and watch. And you know, of course, voles are a huge problem in the blueberry industry. And so encouraging active predation is a viable approach. And online, we have a question. Live outside of Dallas in the hills and want to start a garden. Currently have many ground squirrels on the property. I've been thinking of either digging a 2-foot deep trench and putting hardware cloth into it vertically and backfilling, or just laying down a hardware cloth under a raised bed. Will either work? So, right. Barrier methods, we talk about, like for a tree, putting a mesh in the ground. You can do the same thing with your raised beds. It needs to not just be a sheet mesh. You actually need to tuck it up so that they can't readily work between the edges of the bed and the material itself to get in under. It does not stop them from coming in over the top and burrowing down, so you do need to take any necessary precautions. It is not a perfect solution. It is a pretty effective solution. It's very effective on squirrels in general, as far as ones that are ground squirrels tunneling in. As far as your tree squirrels coming around burying nuts and stuff, it's not going to have much impact. Trenching and putting a barrier in can stop moles. You need to be 18 to 24 inches to have any effect at all, and can deter gophers somewhat. Now, moles do come up. They will cross those barriers if they're really looking for new territory. They spend a very, very little time above ground. Gophers spend plenty of time above ground, and they just come across the top surface and start digging, and you would be amazed at how fast they make a new hole and get down below soil surface. So it's not a perfect solution, but for the guys who are running horizontally through the ground, digging tunnels through the ground, a trench system can deter them to a reasonable degree. Otherwise, yeah, barrier in your raised beds or your bulb patches or your flower beds. One note of caution about putting grid barriers into raised beds: it does really reduce your ability to root crop or use other deep cropped plants unless you have a very deep raised bed. Yes, question.
I have a huge vole problem. I got a little confused when you're talking about the granular baits. We went off to decon and we went off to something, and then you started to say, well, don't use those, use these, not those, use these.
Yeah.
And I got lost.
So, right.
So what do you recommend?
So recommend bait. Okay, so the question was control for voles, large populations of voles, and what are the appropriate baits. So you want to be using phosphorus type baits that are in a grain or a peanut attractant. You can do the baiting stations if you have concentrated enough populations. When you do not have concentrated enough populations, you want to find the tunnels, and you want to put small amounts of bait in every single tunnel that looks like it might be used, because they do move around from tunnel to tunnel and they don't use all of the tunnels all at once. That's the direction you want to be going. And we've got some baits on the shelf if you want to take a look at them that are appropriate there. I like the peanut ones because it seems to attract one of the wider ranges of potential pests. I can use it for voles, I can use it for gophers, I can use it for rats. I get some wood rats sometimes out in the grapes in particular. Well, the grain baits are not always quite as universal. Who likes them? The peanut baits are.
Does that have to stay dry?
Right, so it can get wet briefly, but it degrades really fast. So these granular baits, you can put them right down the hole, and in the summer, if you're not irrigating, that's dry enough. In this time of year, it's not. They'll break down almost immediately. Or the bait stations obviously are to evade exactly that problem, as well as the non-target approaches. Okay, online, oops, get my cursor in the right spot. Will tilling up the soil annually control voles and others depth and or subsoiling appropriate? So regular cultivation will slow down population growths to a degree. You have to be awfully deep to make any difference to a gopher. So I would not recommend it as your primary control. Now, in areas like raised beds or vegetable gardens where you're having a recurrent problem, high density cover crops do deter them. So high density plantings of grains in particular, and to some extent vetch and other substantially rooted cover crops, just simply reduces amount of available diggable space. Not a perfect solution, but it can reduce your populations, and it usually is deep enough to be somewhat effective at least.
So does the vetch attract deer?
Does the vetch attract deer? Not to my experience. I would worry more about Austrian field pea than I would about vetch.
Australian what?
Field pea, one of the other cover crops. Grains do attract deer to a limited degree as well, although you're not usually getting them to the point where they're really super attractive to deer. Cover cropping is a good approach to a lot of problems. It's not obviously a perfect solution to rodent issues, but it can contribute to lower population densities, which is what we're going for. Obviously, we talk about grains being a deterrent for gophers, but they're perfect habitat for voles. Voles love them. Yeah, so yeah, it's again figuring out where your problems are specifically and trying to address those. Yes.
Okay, so if I use the peanuts
Yeah.
in my vegetable garden, that's not gonna have any effect on crops
So
I'm growing?
I would not use them direct. I would not use
Okay.
any of the toxin baits directly in the vegetable garden
Okay.
at all. You are going to have to take other approaches for your critters that are actually in the garden. Outside of the garden, I'm not concerned.
Okay,
Same thing with, by the way, your repellents, the castor oil repellents, you really shouldn't be using in the edible garden.
what about around
Around the perimeter is just fine.
Okay,
Yep,
great.
exactly. Okay, so question online, do I know of any folks or companies who set and maintain traps? You know, unfortunately, that game is a really constantly changing game. What I would do is I would talk to local small farmers and see who they're hiring. Because they don't do it in-house themselves. A lot of them hire, it might be a batch of teenagers with traps that are farm kids that are used to doing this. But I don't know anybody who's really super reliable in terms of outdoor pest control on this scale. It changes around too fast. Yeah, question.
Yeah, short background, I'm a sexton at a cemetery. Okay, and I have large critters going under the headstones. And this presents a possibility of undermining.
Absolutely.
I think they're ground squirrels. In which case, it sounds like a gasser would be my best option. But I'm not seeing the volcanic mold, they don't throw a lot of dirt at it.
Yeah, sounds either rats or ground squirrels. So a large holes with no mound affiliated with a structure. It could be ground squirrels, could be rats. Both of those should control pretty well with gassers because they don't have extensive. They have systems that go down. They don't typically have extensive systems that diffuse the gas. Question online: most effective control of gophers is, well, you can go a batch of ways. Gassers work when populations are not so extensive that the network is too big. Trapping is how most farmers handle it, honestly. A lot of small farmers, yeah. I know. That pasture situation, but like, you know, my folks have about 60 acres, just up north up the valley away, and they hire young farm kids to come out and trap. You don't get them all. You keep the population to a tolerable level. Baits are wonderful controls, but with the secondary toxin level, we always worry about that. Gophers, there's enough of them. It might be the best. It may be your only real effective recourse is to use the baits. Yes.
How about an owl house?
Yeah, encouraging any sort of predator activity is always good control. So that question was about owl houses. Don't have a lot of background in that end of biology, but anything that encourages active rodent predators helps dramatically. And you can see what's happening in your larger ecosphere pretty widely. Look at the power lines. Look at the power lines right now. Okay, so you got about a kestrel every second or third telephone pole out there. Rodent populations are really high. When you start seeing the coyotes out as much in the daytime as at night, you know that you've got a pretty high rodent population in the area. And you see, voles used to really follow these really strong curves, population density, and the predators would be just a year or two behind them, coming up and down, up and down. Agriculture has changed. Now we have much more extensive monocropping of grains, and particularly grass seed. And unfortunately, that has somewhat impacted our ups and downs, and more had up, and stable populations for quite a while. So we don't see some of those swings we used to see more dramatically. And a question online, and I'm sorry, I normally do introduce myself, and I'm Darren Morgan, nursery manager at Shonnard's Nursery. And so it's contact back to me here if you have any follow-ups and questions. Okay, so in the chat, again, I've been successful with gopher traps in the hayfield, but only at certain times of the year. Can't trap when the hay is high, because you can't find them. Can't trap when the dirt just collapses into the holes. Fall and early spring are good times to trap. And I concur with that. Also, from a life cycle standpoint, especially your spring, getting before the next population boom starts in the late spring, early summer. Early spring is a great trapping time for gopher control. All right. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. I'm still around if anybody's got any follow-up questions for this. And for all you folks online, you know where to get back to me if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.